So welcome, thank you for coming. Today we're going to be talking about data protection for vSphere, focusing really on two products, vSphere Replication and vSphere Data Protection. My name is Daniel Miller. I am part of the product management team at VMware, focusing on business continuity and disaster recovery products. And we also have
Pooja Virkuj. Hi, everyone. I'm also from VMware. I'm a product marketing manager in the same group as Daniel.
Okay, go on.
So let me just check this. Good. So just before we get in, some of the things that we're going to be covering today. Of course, this is the Data Protection 101 session, so we'll be talking about the basic data protection techniques. But we will be focusing a lot more, especially in terms of use cases, on backup and replication. So we will go through some of the use cases, the best practices, and also the specific solutions from VMware, which is vSphere Data Protection and vSphere Replication. And we'll also cover how these two work together in certain instances and when you would prefer one over the other. So we'll cover some of those cases as well. When you think of data protection, it's obviously an umbrella term for a lot of things that folks do. There's backup, of course, and when there's backup, you also consider what medium you're backing up to. So it could be backing up to tapes, or it could be backing up to disk as well. This is generally something that you do for almost all of your workloads. It's advisable that you back up most of your data. But there are certain workloads which are likely to be more important than some of the others. And for those cases, we do also look at replication techniques. So you could have synchronous or asynchronous replication. So you're maintaining a replica or a copy of your data, either at the same site or at another site. That replica could update itself. The replicas could be updated in sync when the changes are made to the original. In that case, it's synchronous replication. Or the replicas could be updated with a little bit of lag, and in which case it's asynchronous replication. Generally, when you move up the diagonal from the bottom to the top, the cost of all these techniques is also going to increase. But generally, when you're looking at what technique you would like to protect certain kinds of data, two key metrics are generally used by the industry. One is the recovery time objective, or the RTO, which basically defines how long can you afford to be without that particular data or service. The second one is RPO, which is recovery point objective, which kind of defines how much data can you afford to lose once your service is down for whatever reason. So all of these different techniques have different RTOs and RPOs. For instance, in the case of tape backups, your recovery may not be as reliable as, say, if you're backing up to disk. It'll also take longer to recover from tapes. So your RPOs and RTO for disk backup are obviously going to be better. Likewise, in terms of replication, because you are maintaining a replica of your data at all points in time, it is going to be much more reliable and faster to recover from a replica. Of course, it's also going to be more expensive. And of course, there's other things like snapshots as well, and we'll cover that in detail in the coming slides. But let's look at some of the use cases and also some of the specific RPOs, RTOs, and retention policies that you might consider when you look at these techniques. So let's go from the bottom up, backup being the more foundational element of your data protection strategy. Backup is something you'll do for almost all of your workloads. You generally tend to have daily backups, and in some cases, it'll be weekly backups. Usually, you'll keep your backups around for several months so that you can recover from a specific point in time a few months ago, maybe. It's basically going to protect you from any kind of data loss, data corruption issues, things like that. In some cases, of course, you might need it for compliance reasons as well. There are other use cases, for instance, say you're doing a patch or a maintenance to some server, and you want to ensure that after doing that patch, if something goes wrong, you are able to go back to your previous state. In that case, you will use a snapshot. Snapshots will generally reside on the same storage where your VM is residing, so it obviously poses a little bit of risk in terms of losing that data, but snapshots is not something you're going to keep around for long periods of time, like a backup would be, right? So your retention is typically in days. In the case of replication, it's obviously more expensive to replicate all your data, so you're only going to be using it for those mission-critical workloads of yours. Replication, obviously, recovery from it is going to be much faster because it's an exact replica. It's usually in minutes, maybe even sub-minutes, right? And most of the times, especially in the case of synchronous replication, it will kind of guarantee zero data loss. Replication is also particularly great to protect from any kind of site-level disaster. So if your primary or production site goes down, if you have a replica at your DR site, then you can immediately recover from that replica as well. So let's dive just a little bit more into snapshots, specifically virtual machine snapshots in the VMware world. It basically captures the state and data of your virtual machine at a specific point in time. So it could be, state by state we mean, whether is the virtual machine powered on or off, or has it been suspended, and all your virtual disk files. It basically allows rapid return to a specific point in time in case you did that maintenance or upgrade work. But when a snapshot is taken, there is no deduplication or no data compression of that particular data, so it is going to consume a lot of disk storage, which is why snapshots are typically not retained for months on an end, and you don't snapshot every single workload that you have. It's not a form of backup. The other thing is that it does have some I/O impact, so again, it's not something that you would do in every scenario. And it does not provide certain things which backup applications would provide. For instance, the ability to recover specific items from your virtual machine, or the ability to do application-aware backups. So in terms of backup, the solution from VMware is vSphere Data Protection. It basically comes in two editions. The basic vSphere Data Protection, or VDP, is included with most editions of vSphere. There is vSphere Data Protection Advanced. The most current version, which is recently launched, is 5.8. It's basically VMware's backup and recovery tool, which integrates completely with the vSphere infrastructure. It uses snapshots to perform backups, but it basically uses EMC's Avamar technology in the backend to actually deduplicate those backups using variable length deduplication techniques. So the key thing is that it makes all the backups as storage efficient as possible by eliminating any kind of redundancy in your data. Other things, it provides application awareness. So mission critical applications, some of the Microsoft applications are supported. It provides application aware backups for them. And other things like single-step recovery and just ease of use, basically, because it is managed through the vSphere infrastructure itself. It is deployed as a virtual appliance, a Linux-based virtual appliance, very simple installation. Usually, most admins have taken around 60 minutes or less to deploy the appliance itself. It's managed completely from the vSphere web client, so the same UI that you use for everything else. You don't need to learn anything new. You can back up individual virtual machines or containers of virtual machines, so you can back up data centers, clusters, resource pools. Likewise, in terms of recovery, you can recover individual files, folders, or directories, and it's simple single-step recovery. And end-user file level recovery is also supported. In terms of application awareness, three Microsoft applications are supported: Exchange, SQL Server, and SharePoint. For all of these, most workloads it's best to protect them without any agents, and VDP does not have agents for all the other workloads. But for application-aware backups, it is usually recommended to have an agent which is able to integrate with the backup APIs of these applications and perform transaction-consistent backups. It also gives you that granular level recovery for these applications. So for instance, you can back up a specific SQL database. You can recover a specific Exchange database or an Exchange mailbox even. And you can also do this on physical servers as well, not just when these applications are virtualized. So we looked at local data protection, basically. So this is where you're doing backups at your local site or your primary site. But for those of you who do have another site, DR site or another data center where you can maintain another copy of your backup, a remote copy of your backups, that is usually advisable because that will protect you from any kind of local site failure. So VDP Advanced has the ability to replicate your backups from your original VDP appliance, say in site A, to another appliance in site B. It, of course, doesn't have to be VDP in both locations. In case you have a central data center which is running Avamar, for instance, or you have a contract with the service provider who is running Avamar, then you can also replicate to an Avamar server. In terms of replication, very flexible topologies are supported, one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many as well. The replication itself, it needs to be very efficient because when it comes to replication, like we said, it's expensive, so you need to be cost conscious and you need to ensure that the amount of bandwidth you consume is the minimal possible. So because VDP Advanced utilizes that deduplication, it is able to compress and deduplicate the data before sending it across the wire, so it sends only the unique segments across the network. This ensures that your network bandwidth requirements are also minimum possible. The replication stream is also encrypted for better security. The new thing in 5.8 in VDP Advanced is that you can now restore from your replicated backups either at the primary site or at the DR site. This is because you can now browse your replicated restore points from either site. So if your primary is down and you want to recover at your DR site, you just browse your replicated restore points, select the one you want to restore, and you can restore it directly at the DR site as well. Another new feature in VDP Advanced 5.8 is the ability to use SCSI hot add, which is a much more efficient way of doing backups through the use of external proxies. So suppose you have multiple clusters and you want to back up those clusters, you now don't need to use NBD as your network transfer mode. You can deploy a proxy at each of those clusters, which is essentially a small virtual appliance. Use SCSI hot add, and that proxy will not only deduplicate the data, but it will ensure that it is able to put less impact on your network when it is sending the data across to the main VDP appliance. This basically allows you to not just back up the 8 virtual machines that you could before, but it allows you now the flexibility of backing up to 24 virtual machines at a time. So you can dial up or dial down depending upon the network bandwidth and resources that are available to you. So that's VDP Advanced, which you can use to back up specific applications or some of the business critical ones that we discussed. But suppose you want to back up vCenter itself. vCenter is obviously critical to your infrastructure. So suppose you want to back that up, then VDP can do that as well. Just make sure that you're doing it at a time when there's slightly less load on the vCenter. vCenter itself probably is either deployed in one of two ways. All the components in a single virtual machine, or the different components, that is the vCenter server, the database, single sign-on, the different inventory services, all those in separate virtual machines. So when it's all in one virtual machine, that's no problem. Just create one single backup job, schedule it, and you're done. But if it's those different virtual machines, then it is advisable to create separate backup jobs for each of these, and then ensure that each of these have the same schedule. So if you're doing daily backups, then ensure that all of them have daily backups, or weekly, depending on whatever you want. And then schedule them in a specific order. So that's actually very nicely given on the website as well, but it's usually in the order of doing the database VM, the server, the inventory services, web client, and then the single sign-on. So you schedule those backups in that order, and then for the database VM, it's advisable to also use app-consistent backups. And that's it. That's it for backups. When you want to actually do a recovery, it is good to use the emergency restore feature of VDP to actually do the recovery. The emergency restore feature is accessible through the VDP configure UI. You just go in there, select which restore point you want, click restore, like you see on the screen, and that's it. But when you're powering on the VMs, ensure that you power them on again in a specific order, which is kind of the reverse order from the one in which we used for backups. So you will do, in this case, single sign-on first, which will allow you to do the sign-on, and then web client, the vSphere web client, inventory services, the server VM, and database VM. Then just log into the host, log into web client, and check that VDP is accessible, just the basic checks, and that's it. So basically, the emergency restore feature allows you to restore without having any dependency on the vCenter server, and as a result, it gives you the ability to back up vCenter server itself. So that's basically backup cases. I mean, you're using a backup tool in general to back up your VM data, to do application-aware backups, and to not just do it locally, but also have another copy at a different site by replicating that. Let's look at the other solution, which is vSphere Replication, which will cover more of the replication scenarios. I'll hand it over to Daniel for that.
Thanks. So actually a couple things I wanted to add on the VDP front. One is that it comes in two flavors, actually. So there's VDP and VDP Advanced. So VDP is actually included with vSphere. So any of you out there with Essentials Plus and above can go out and try out this product free of charge. It has certain limitations in terms of scale and some of the features, like we don't have the agents, we don't support, we don't enable replication. Those can be purchased at an additional cost. But it's a great way just to get your hands on the product, demo it out, actually even use it in production if that suits your needs. And even for things like protecting vCenter, I think is pretty much a no-brainer because you're already entitled to the product. And then if you see if it has a good fit in your environment, you purchase those additional licenses to use the agents, the replication. It's all built off best-of-breed deduplication and backup technologies that's been out in the market for a very long time. Likewise, vSphere Replication, which I'm going to cover today, is another product that's bundled and included with the platform as well, as long as you have Essentials Plus and above, which I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, have here today. And I'm actually surprised by how many customers I speak to that aren't even aware of this product. So just want to give you a high-level overview today. So vSphere Replication, also known as VR, is a host-based or hypervisor-based replication, asynchronous replication product. So it's very different from VDP, very different from backup products, and I'll kind of get into the details there. I think the primary difference is that we do not leverage snapshots. I'll say that again, no snapshots when using vSphere Replication. So I think a lot of people have this misconception that all we're doing is taking a snap and replicating it to a target site, like some of the other products out there in the industry, traditional backup products, even VDP. There's actually no product out there that does replication like this from a host-based perspective. So just some of the high-level features, because of how we do our deltas, and we're not taking snapshots, we're able to achieve things like a 15-minute RPO. So you can tune this 15 minutes, 1 hour, 18 minutes, 24 hours, whatever you feel like, and we'll make sure we replicate those changes across to your target site or even to the same data center to alternate hardware if that's what your SLA is. And on top of that, providing multiple point-in-time recovery. So today we support up to 24 points in time. So for example, if you've defined a 1 hour RPO, you'll be able to roll back up to a full day. This also supports, because of where this product sits in the hypervisor, this supports replication between any type of data store. So whether you've got SAN deployed, NAS, vSAN even, you can replicate to and from heterogeneously. So from vSAN to non-vSAN, from SAN to NAS, it doesn't really matter because of where we sit in the stack in terms of replication. Basically, we're moving the blocks before they even hit storage. We do have some guest awareness for quiescing Windows applications, leveraging VSS, and also we have Linux coming soon as well. And that's slightly different in that we actually do require a snapshot there, just so we capture that quiet state and know when to replicate the changes. But in general, it's typically snapshotless replication, and because of that, it minimizes the impact on the VMware environment, on the virtual environment. And one slightly new feature we've added here, not only can you go from any type of data store to any type of data store, we've integrated natively with vCloud Air. So, and I'm actually going to do a theater session today at 3 p.m. over in our booth, and I'll giving a demo of the integration with vCloud Air. And that's a really cool feature, just out of the box, just a few clicks here and there. Once you've purchased your vCloud infrastructure, you can start replicating your virtual machines to the cloud. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a bit. So how does all this work? I know this was meant to be a one-on-one session, but I wanted to get a little bit into the details, the technical details on how vSphere replication works, because it is so very different from snapshots and typical traditional backup. So there's really two processes. One is the full or initial sync, and you have two options there. You can start fresh and just send your data over, begin replicating it, or you can use, you can seed your VMs using physical media. So if you have, let's say, a couple hundred VMs, terabytes of data, you just want to put that on some physical disk, ship it over to your secondary site, and use that as a seed. We fully support that. What it does next is once you've done the pairing, the site pairings, and you point it at the target, you'll have an option to use a seed or not. If you use a seed, it'll calculate a checksum of blocks on both sides and basically compare deltas. From that point on, it'll just move over the delta block. So that's what what's being represented here with the BDE letters. Once it does that and completes that initial full sync, things kick over into what we call a delta sync. So what this picture is showing here is a little bit kind of double clicking into the stack, showing a few of the different components of vSphere replication. So you see we have our host, a VM, and then we have our VR service and our VR filter. Think of it as an IO filter that sits in between the VM and the storage that passes through all writes to the storage and also tracks blocks so it knows what writes are new writes, the change blocks, and will ship those over to a target VR server, which could be sitting at a secondary site in some other geographical location or even at another physical piece of hardware, say in your same data center. And then it writes that to the target storage. So what's really nice about this is it doesn't require a stun of the VM, no snapshot. It's kind of just happening in the background. This filter is integrated in the hypervisor, so there's nothing additional to install other than the management appliance. And then for any target site, you need just another small VM, which we're calling the VR server here. And that's what receives the bits and actually writes them to the host, through the host to the storage. So all this, it's kind of similar to CBT, if you're familiar with that in the backup world, where we will track the change blocks and only transfer the change blocks. And we actually call this a lightweight delta. So if you hear that term, it's referring to what we do in vSphere replication. So just to touch a little bit on what's new in 5.8. So 5.8 wasn't a really big release for us. 6.0 will have a lot more enhancements for vSphere replication. I can't go into details there, but I think you guys will be pretty impressed with what we have coming in 6.0. For 5.8 though, we did have the opportunity to add some enhanced reporting. So what we have is kind of these dashboards, basically a dashboard view in the VR GUI that gives you a whole bunch of different types of statistics. So here what I'm showing is transferred bytes over time, RPO violations, and also number of VMs replicated by host. What's cool about this is you can tune it for a specific time period. There are a whole lot of other things you can report on as well. So it's really easy to do some high-level analytics. So you can go out and say, if you're seeing some kind of trend, let's say once a week at midnight, you're seeing a big spike in data transferred and it's causing RPO violations. So you can go and look at that and okay, do some troubleshooting. What's going on here? What's happening at midnight? So it just gives you a really nice, easy way to have an overview into your replication environment and how it may be impacting your network storage and compute infrastructure. Also wanted to touch on Site Recovery Manager. So this is one of the key use cases for vSphere replication, is using VR along with SRM. I think there's also some confusion out there when I speak to customers and that they think SRM and VR are kind of equivalent or overlapping products, but SRM is really an orchestration tool for automated DR orchestration. SRM itself does not do any type of replication. SRM works with replication providers such as vSphere replication or array-based replication, as you may have with RecoverPoint, NetApp, EMC VNX, whatever you have, HP. What's cool about vSphere replication and SRM though is it gives you the VM level replication, whereas using SRM with array-based replication is at the LUN level. So you don't really have the granularity to select individual VMs, and you're using replication at the LUN level. What's nice about that, though, is it does leverage the array technology, so you may get better performance, additional features, better compression, dedupe, things like that. But vSphere replication, all the features that I just mentioned, do work with SRM. So it's really nice to be able to use that product, VR, which is free, along with SRM to orchestrate disaster recovery of many hundreds of virtual machines. And there's plenty of SRM sessions this week if you want to learn more about SRM. Great product. Another item I wanted to talk about, it's not really new in 5.8. We introduced this earlier this year, and it's the DR to the cloud I touched on. So this is very interesting, actually. So we've created in vCloud kind of a new virtual data center. It's a DR-specific one, if you will, which is actually lower cost than the normal data centers you would purchase through vCloud Air, and which provides kind of a warm standby for disaster recovery. This is a great way if for those of you that may not have a secondary site, or maybe you have secondary sites but not dedicated DR sites, and you just want to try something out for relatively low cost. I believe the price starts at under $1,000, which gives you like 10 gigs of compute, or a gig of, and like 10 gigs of RAM or something like that. I can't remember all the details. But it's literally just point and click. If you're familiar with VR and the current wizard to target, say, one of your own sites, it's as simple as entering your vCloud Air credentials and the URL for your virtual data center and just start replicating. We've actually added a few new features with this service. A couple things. One is there's a completely new UI on the provider side. So you can manage everything directly from the vCloud Air UI, whether you want to do a failover, a recovery, a plan migration, even monitor your replication from the cloud side. You can do all that in addition to from on-prem. We also added test failover capabilities, which isn't in the on-prem only. If you're, say, replicating from 2 of your own sites, you would have to purchase SRM for that. But what we added in this, at no additional charge, is the ability to test failover specific workloads. So what that means is you can bring up your virtual machines that you're replicating in a test bubble, isolated network, for example, without disrupting the ongoing replication. So it allows you to test really easy, just a couple clicks of the button, and then also clean up your test once you've finished that. And so we support all the RPOs, 15 minutes to 24 hours. We also support seeding. so vCloud Air, I almost said VCHS, vCloud Air will take your physical media and load it up into your virtual data center that you've provisioned in the cloud, specific for DR, and seed it for you. And so they've got a few regions in the US, I believe a few internationally as well. Check their website out. But again, this is another highly recommended feature just because it's so easy to use, so cheap, and I think it provides a lot of value. If you want to demo this, again, come by the theater at 3 p.m. and I'll walk through a quick 10-minute demo. One other thing we added, and how many VR users do we have out there today? Okay, close to half. When I talk to customers, they always ask me, how can I better size my environment? How do I know, how can I better define my change rates? How do I know how much network VR is going to consume? How do I define my RPOs so I don't have RPO violations left and right? So we've started to work towards building kind of a more end-to-end sizing tool, sizing suite, if you will. There's a Fling out there today that will go out and actually use real data and check change rates and not actually do a real replication over the network and spit out these nice reports. So just Google VMware Fling vSphere Replication, you'll find it. And ideally, you would use that in conjunction with this new web-based tool, which takes a number of different inputs that hopefully you'll have a pretty good idea of in your environment. So things like change rate, and this is something you could get from that Fling. Things like packet loss, hopefully you have somebody in your network team that can tell you your packet loss rate, latency, and your bandwidth or your throughput. Average VM size, capacity utilization, if you've got thin VMs versus thick and how much they're actually being used. And you can basically input all these different things into this tool and solve for one of three things. So you could solve for RPO, and for any of these you solve for one of these three, you have to know the other two. So if you want to solve for RPO, you need to input your number of VMs and your network bandwidth, and it'll tell you the maximum RPO you can have if you want to replicate 100 VMs over, say, a gigabit network, given these other things like VM size and change rate, will be 25 minutes. So it'll spit out a number like that and provide some guidance for you. And same for a number of VMs. Maybe you know your RPO. You have like a dozen VMs that you know, I must replicate these with a 15-minute RPO. And it'll tell you like what network bandwidth you'll need. Maybe you need to upgrade your network infrastructure. And on the flip side, you could say, well, I have my RPO, I know my bandwidth, that's not going to change, it's not in the budget, so at least tell me how many VMs I can replicate and meet this recovery point objective, my SLAs basically, and it'll spit out that number. So this is actually available, I believe now we're tweaking a few things here and there, but we'll send out a link to the community, and this is all web-based, so available, I'll go out and say this week. Okay. So kind of going back to VDP, I want to touch on using these two products together. So hopefully now it's clear how they're different, both from a use case and features perspective and also from a technology perspective. I think these products are very complementary. I recommend customers to actually use both products in their environment depending on their SLAs. So just a high-level overview of how these two products work differently. vSphere Replication replicates data from primary storage to primary storage. So slightly higher cost profile in that those VMs that you're replicating are going to they're basically boot ready because you have very aggressive RTOs with VMs that you're typically protecting with vSphere Replication. So they were just ready to go, do a failover, and it'll basically boot up the VM. VDP is different in that you're hitting backup media. So you're going to back it up to secondary storage, in this case, a virtualized deduplication store, which is probably sitting on some other data store that's not your production data store. And then when you replicate that, that's hitting another backup dedupe store. So again, it's still not boot ready per se. When you do a recovery, the RTOs are slightly longer because you have to move that data from your backup media to your production environment and then boot it up. So slightly different profiles depending on the applications and their SLAs you have in your environment. Choose one and the other, or even both. So VR, if you have RTOs in the range of minutes, you just need to get your data up and running. You can't afford any downtime. use that, especially with its integration with SRM. If you have, say, if you need to bring up an entire site. VDP doesn't really have that. No backup product actually has that SRM integration. RPO, again, 15 minutes to 24-hour intervals. Use cases there, DR, testing DR, planned migration is another key use case our customers use with vSphere replication, hardware failure, logical corruption. VDP, we're talking about RTO on the order of probably hours. Not for a single VM. It doesn't take a single VM hours to restore, especially when you have things like change block restore. That's actually, we've seen that done in seconds. But if you're talking about many, many VMs, it might take hours. And your RPO, typically you're only doing a daily backup, or maybe even less, a weekly backup. So there's bigger potential for data loss there. But what you get with that is local protection, which you may not do with VR. You get long-term retention. VR won't keep your data longer than, like, say, a day. So if you have compliance, if you need to keep it for 6 months, a year, maybe even more if you're using like an external data domain device, that's going to be your product. And the other one is application consistency. So if you really need that deep integration, say with VSS, where you're doing like log backups, you're truncating your logs, you're doing incrementals and diffs and all these things, these different application-specific workflows, VDP is your product, VDP Advanced specifically. And also the granular recovery, whether you're doing files or say just an individual SQL database as opposed to like a whole VM with all the databases and the server instance and all of that. It's that's what you're going to want to use VDP for. However, if you choose to use both products for the same VMs, there are a few things to watch out for. One is on the application side. If you're using VDPA and vSphere replication, do not turn on quiescing with vSphere replication. You already have access to the agents. These agents have deep integration with the backup-specific APIs for these applications, so they're going to do a much better job of protecting your apps. A couple problems with vSphere replication in protecting your applications. One is the VSS integration we have is relatively shallow. It just does a generic like full copy backup of your applications. If you want more granular recovery and backup support, use the VDPA agents. The other issue is if you have, say, like a 15-minute RPO with vSphere replication, it's going to do a snap and a quiesce every 15 minutes. And that's probably going to overload your application. It's just too much. So you probably don't want to do that more than like on a daily interval, for example. So again, use VDPA. On the RPO side, make sure you only use the RPOs that are required of your applications. I've talked to a lot of customers. They're like, oh, that's great. VR supports 15-minute RPO. I'll just turn 15 minutes up to all my VMs because at the end of the day, it's moving the same amount of data, right? Whether it's 15-minute or 24 hours. It's actually not. Now I'm going to walk you through an example of why you're going to be moving more data for the same workload, whether it's 15 minutes an hour or 24 hours. And also disable the multiple point-in-time recovery on VR if you're already using VDP and you're getting the point-in-time recovery through VDP. That's because when vSphere replication, when you've enabled PITs, or MPITs we call it, it stores the data with a snapshot hierarchy. And if you've got like 24 snaps, for example, that's a long hierarchy of VMFS snaps, which will have a big impact, I/O impact on your VM as you do a recovery and then do a consolidation, we call it. So when you want to bring it to a specific point in time, it has to basically replay all those redo logs. And if you don't, it's even a bigger I/O impact if you're trying to read through a VM that has this huge snapshot hierarchy in it because the blocks are mapped all over the place. So introduces latency. Lastly is avoid replicating with VDPA unless it's absolutely necessary if you're also using VR. So if VR already satisfies your offsite DR needs, just don't do it with VDPA just because you can. I'd say just keep VDPA for local backup, application awareness, and VR for the offsite recovery, if that satisfies your SLAs. So just to double click on the impact of RPO on data transferred, I'm going to use this, and this actually applies to any product. that has a concept of an RPO. So I'm just using vSphere replication, for example, I don't know, comparing 10 minutes and 60 minutes, but the same could be said for like VDP comparing a day and 7 days. So we start with the base VM. These blocks here, these blue boxes, blue and white boxes represent, say, new blocks that are being written to a VM. It transfers the base. This is the baseline. So whether it's a 10-minute or 60-minute RPO, you're going to do the full sync and transfer this data. And then you have new data introduced 10 minutes later. If your 10-minute RPO policy will move those change blocks. 60 minutes, it's not going to do anything, and it's going to wait for 60 minutes and move them all at once. So now we introduce a change, not really writing new blocks, but overriding existing blocks. The 10-minute RPO will capture that. Add some new blocks, those will get sent. Introduce another change, those will get sent. Introduce a change and add some new blocks, those will get sent as well. Now, 60 minutes later, what happens in the end? Let's introduce a few more new blocks. Basically, do I have a laser pointer here? I don't think so. The 60-minute RPO will only transfer what's the delta between the first base and the last. So you could see here, we're just moving those chunks on the bottom right for 60-minute RPO. For 10-minute RPO, we're only moving the last delta, right, which is those 2 green blocks. But if you look at it in sum, you're moving a lot more data with the 10-minute RPO. And worst case scenario, you could think like, what if you were just changing, I don't know, a PowerPoint file and you change it like every 10 minutes, just one slide back and forth for a whole day. You'd be syncing all those changes, whereas if you only had a 24-hour RPO, it'd just be one single change. So be careful about your RPOs. I think conceptually, a lot of people think, oh, well, if I do it once a day or 10 times a day, it's the same data being written. But it's a very big difference. So just to kind of bring it back to the original slide that Pooja presented, these are just 2 parameters that kind of define different data protection techniques, RPO and RTO, probably the most well understood ones. But I would say there's probably a 3rd or 4th dimension here as well, which would be, one of them would be retention. Take retention into account. For example, synchronous replication products probably have the least amount of retention because they're capturing so much data, whereas tape you probably have very long, like 7 years or whatever you need. And the other one is just general feature set. So whether you support applications, whether you have dedupe, compression, encryption, all of that. So where do our products fit on this map here? VDP, again, right there in the middle, we're talking about greater than 24-hour or equal to or greater than 24-hour RPOs. RTOs in the hour range, maybe minutes depending on how many VMs. Retention, days to months. You need app consistency. Self-service file level recovery. I didn't really touch on that. That one's a really great feature of VDP. And protection of your actual vSphere infrastructure like vCenter. And vSphere replication, slightly above and to the right. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a better product. It's just a different product. RPOs of less than 24 hours. We're talking about RTOs of minutes, retention in hours, great use case with SRM, and lastly with the cloud-based DR with vCloud Air. So I think that's our last slide. Any questions out there from the audience today? Yeah. Most of it, some of it's actually 5.8, what's new coming out like right around now. Yeah, we're announcing 5.8 at this show. Yeah, so some of these features in VDP specifically are new with 5.8. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, how does VR handle loss in connectivity? And what the VR product does is it keeps a map of the delta blocks locally. So if you have a loss of connectivity, it's going to continue to map those blocks and keep track of them, and it'll know which ones were sent versus which ones weren't. So the next time you get your network back up, it'll try to send those change blocks over. But what you might get is an alarm for an RPO violation. So like if you set a 15-minute RPO and your network was down for half an hour, it'll try to resync and catch up, but you'll get an alarm saying you had an RPO violation.
What if it was in the middle of transferring it? Had transferred some and then the link goes down?
That's fine, because yeah, it always does a kind of a checksum between what's sent and what's at the local. Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah, question here?
Does this require you to have virtual vCenter servers?
Does this require you to have virtual vCenter servers? No, it does not. Question? Can you QoS vSphere replication traffic? You might be able to. I don't believe that is officially supported. So are you kind of talking about like throttling the bandwidth? So, okay. So we do have actually something we're working on that is using network I/O control that can accomplish that, and we're probably going to publish like a white paper or a KB article on how to throttle the network. But I would say, you know, we haven't really tested that using QoS with VR. Yeah. Question? Can you encrypt the replication traffic natively? Today, no, we don't have native encryption, except for when replicating to vCloud Air. So that is natively encrypted going to vCloud Air, but the use case typically is between two sites and within a single customer, which usually already has a VPN or a private line, and so that's not an issue for going to the cloud. We did add encryption. We are looking at that in the future, but we have actually a number of customers that use products like Silver Peak, for example, in between. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, back here.
She mentioned, is this on? She mentioned with the DPA, that it's based upon the Avamar technology. If you wanted to do off-site copies, she says about going directly to Avamar. Does it have to be to Avamar? Can it go to a different storage point, like a data domain or something like that?
Yes, it does. Yes, 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 and yes.
Fair enough. And then the other part is with the, I guess with both the replication and the data protection, it's specifically only within components that are managed through vCenter, correct? Like I can't do anything, if I have a NAS head like off of an NSX.
Sorry, what off of
sorry, off of a VNX. If I'm doing SIF shares off of that, for example, can I do data protection off of that?
For either product, we have to see VM through VC.
Okay.
Anything else?
Right.
Yeah.
Is replication, let's say your site A fails and everyone's running off site B. Once site A is fixed, does replication push whatever's newest on site B back to site A?
Not automatically.
No.
So if you want kind of more of those automated workflows, that's where SRM comes in.
Okay.
So in that case, site A goes down, site B, you do a failover, your VMs come up, you start using them there, they get new data, and then you would just replicate back in reverse, and then using the old VMs as the seed, so you wouldn't have to replicate all the new data.
So you do require SRM for that though?
That, what I just described, no, it's just manual. If you want like kind of more of the one button, you know, big green button and some of the automated fillback and all that, okay. SRM helps orchestrate that for large numbers of VMs, but if you want to do that on like single VM, just click on it and do that manually, that's totally supported with vSphere replication.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
Catastrophic failure of site A, failover, you can use site B, DRSS seeds to recreate site A.
So the question is, if you lose site A, fail over in site B, and then you want to use the site B as the seed for going back to site A? Yeah. So if you bring site A back up, two things could happen. Your VMs are still there in some form, and you can just use those as a seed and replicate over the deltas. If they're completely gone, then yeah, the new site B, whatever's there, will just serve as the new seed, and it's a full sync. So it just might take a little bit longer, but yeah, that works. Yep. To protect vSAN? vCenter. You can do that. I honestly think VDP is a better product. The reason for that is if you've lost vCenter, you won't be able to use vSphere replication. So that's the problem. You don't have that redundancy. With VDP, if you lose vCenter, we have that emergency restore screen, which is a separate web UI, and so you can recover it. Yeah. Yeah, if it's a VM, and we will replicate any VM. So sure, yeah. Yep. Does VDP have a plugin for Active Directory?
We don't have Active Directory yet. So if it's Active Directory virtualized, then yes, regular VM, but not specifically for Active Directory.
Yeah. File and folder for Unix and Linux.
Yep.
For Linux, yes. Supporting now.
LVM and ext4 as well for Linux, yes.
Yeah. Anything else? One more question here. Are there any plans to merge these into a single product? Very good question. Not in the 6.0 timeframe, but longer term roadmap, we are looking at, if I go back to that use cases slide where we show synchronous, async, backup, snapshots, all that, and all the use cases. Yes, over time we do have a vision and strategy that we can bring all these together in a single, unified Uber data protection product, but not in 6.0. Synchronous replication? Not at the moment. No, not with either of these products.
Just wanted to show the sessions.
Oh, yeah. So just one last thing. We have a lot of other related VMworld sessions. If you want to go a little bit deeper on VDP Advanced, data protection for vSAN using our products, SRM, we have plenty of sessions. And then again, I have a theater today at 3 p.m. if you want to see a little bit about the vCloud Air DR service. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.